Hello, my scary friends. I'm afraid of those eyes. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. I met Gabriel in freshman year of college, in the lecture hall of my Foundations of Drawing class. It was the first day of school. None of us knew each other. There were two left-handed desks crammed into the first row, and we were both lefties. Sometimes becoming acquainted is as simple as that. Gabe and I quickly grew closer as we discovered that we rode our bikes down the same road every morning to get to campus. We both ducked our heads in quiet embarrassment when models posed in the nude for our figure drawing class. We both showed up to the corner cafe 2 blocks from the dorms at duskfall. Gabe loved people watching, just gazing out at the slowly darkening street until the wisps of steam coming off his mug petered out and the streetlights flickered on. I sipped my spiced coffee and doodled in my sketchbook. When a year went by and fall came back around and we didn't feel so much like two little boys lost in a bigger world, we moved out of our respective dorm rooms and got an apartment together. Gabe had the tiny room in the back with the ratty carpet. I slept on the couch, and the kitchen table was for drawing. Our landlord was a cranky old woman, and if nothing fearful and unusual ever happened, I'm sure she would have kept our security deposit for staining the glossy wood with paint. Looking back on it, I was friends with Gabe for a remarkably long time before I noticed anything unusual about him. When I finally did come around to it, it happened entirely by accident. I remember that it was a cold Monday morning that teetered on the edge of winter. Having just gotten out of bed, in my groggy, half-asleep state, I staggered to the bathroom and opened the door without thinking. It knocked into something before it could open all the way and I heard Gabe's slightly muffled yelp. Realizing the bathroom was occupied, I stammered an apology and began to close the door when I caught a glimpse of the mirror. By all means, from my position, I should have been able to see any occupant in the bathroom. But all I saw through the mirror were the white tiled walls and the towel rack. "Gabe?" I said carefully. There was no answer. My brain rationalized that I had misheard his voice, and I pushed on the door again. Something shuffled inside the room. Then the door swung open all the way. A chill went down my back. Gabriel was standing in front of the sink, holding a razor with his dimpled chin draped in white foam. His eyes stared straight ahead, and in the gaps in the shaving foam, I could see that his lips were tense. I glanced at the mirror. The bathroom reflected in it was empty. I looked back at my roommate. Gabe exhaled slowly. "Act like everything's normal," he said quietly. He turned his head and I flinched. His eyes settled on mine and he gazed at me steadily. "Please," he said. "Let's not talk about this again." I clutched the doorknob. "Okay." I swallowed the cold lump in my throat. Then I nodded stiffly. Gabe smiled, but I could tell it was forced. I backed away from the door and gently pulled it closed. Then I went to my couch and sat on it cross-legged, staring at the floor. 5 minutes later, Gabe came out of the bathroom, cleanly shaven. "You can use the bathroom now," he said. He was smiling a real smile this time. Like everything was okay. "Leo?" I stared up at him. His eyes softened with something resembling pity. "You look like you've seen a ghost. You okay?" I fidgeted with my blankets to get the cold sweat off my palms. Then I managed the best nod that I could. "Yeah," I breathed. "Yeah, everything's okay." Gabe never brought the incident up again. I did my best to act like nothing was unusual, but I couldn't help but steal glances at car windows and polished storefronts whenever I walked with him, shuddering when I saw only myself in the reflection. No mirror or glossy surface could show me the image of my roommate. Not even the puddles on the roadside after the cold winter rain. "I wish you would tell me how," I said one evening, as we sat at the patio table of our old corner cafe. Gabe's shoulders slumped ever so slightly and he took his eyes off the dusky blue street. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I know you do." That morning, when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I flicked my wrist a bit too quickly, a careless stroke on my toned grey sketchbook. My pencil snapped at its tip. Gabe rummaged in his pocket and handed me his pocket knife, and I used its tiny, iridescent blade to slowly sharpen my pencil, exposing the soft lead again bit by bit. When the silence became unbearable, Gabe finally let out a small sigh. "I'm no different than most, Leo," he said. "Think of it as the difference between having brown eyes or blue eyes. Either way, you can be a perfectly regular person." "But..." Gabe smiled slightly. "Let's act like everything's normal, okay? I know it's selfish, but it makes me happy." I wanted to protest, but Gabe began to stand up like we were done talking. I reluctantly followed, and we walked home in silence. The following Tuesday, 3 buildings on campus were evacuated and shut down from a reported bomb threat. One of them was where our drawing and composition class was supposed to be, so Gabe and I got a fortuitous afternoon off. I drove the 2 of us to a nearby burger joint to get lunch, and as we sat at the old-style diner table with classic 80s rock playing on the overhead speakers, I slid my basket of garlic fries to him. "You should try it. It's really good." Gabe stared at me strangely. "What?" I asked. He sat back against the shiny red seat back, pushed up his glasses, and crossed his arms. "Leo, why don't you trust me?" I felt my face flush. "What do you mean? Don't try to play dumb. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you wearing a crucifix on a necklace? You never wore jewelry before last week." My hand scrambled to my neck without my permission. The neckline of my t-shirt hung lower than I expected. The tiny silver cross dangled just above my collar. "What do you think I am, Leo?" Gabe smiled sadly. "That's a little funny," he said. "That you believe in fairy tales. You're a college student, and you think your roommate might be. It's not like that." Gabe reached over, took a garlic fry, and ate it. Some part of me, deep down inside, twisted in excitement and fear. Nothing happened. "I hate to break it to you," Gabe said, "but vampires aren't real." "I need you to tell me why, then," I said quickly, trying to hide my embarrassment. "Why what? Why you don't have a reflection?" Gabe glanced around at the chattering people all around us. I could tell he didn't want to talk, especially in a crowded restaurant at lunchtime, but I wasn't going to let him drop the ball again. He must have realized that because he sighed grudgingly. "You ever watch the Disney version of Peter Pan?" he asked. "You just laughed at me for believing in fairy tales. This is a metaphor. You know how Peter Pan loses his shadow, and how the shadow runs away from him with a mind of its own. You lost your reflection?" He nodded grimly. "I don't know if it's something that can happen to everyone," he said. "I've never seen anyone else without a reflection. But maybe..." "Maybe what?" Gabe sat back in his chair again, averting his eyes. I watched him, waiting until he leaned in stiffly and spoke in a low voice. Maybe I'm not so special, Leo. Have you thought about that? Maybe all reflections are creatures of their own, and they just haven't come out of the mirror yet. There is a thin line between shy and fearful. Gabe was shy, but I had never once seen him afraid. At that moment, for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. His apprehension scared me. He took in a short breath. When he opened his mouth again, his words came faster, one after another. Maybe everyone's reflections are always watching from the other side of the mirror, he said. And when you're a terrible enough person, they get fed up and then they crawl out of the mirror, and close their hands around your throat and choke you until you're half dead, and whisper nightmarish things in your ear to haunt you for the rest of your life, and run away never to be seen again. Ever. I stared at him, wide-eyed. It's not true, I muttered. Is it? Did that really happen? Gabe said nothing. I wanted to believe that he was lying, that this was all somehow an elaborate prank. But Gabriel had no reflection, and I couldn't deny what I had seen. Gabe quietly cleared his throat, took his elbows off the table, and fidgeted with the case of his tiny iridescent pocket knife. I've said too much. Why did your reflection think you were a terrible person? Leo, please. Let's act like everything's normal. Everything isn't normal, I said, my tone verging on a plea. What did you do? I don't want to talk about it. What did your reflection tell you? I don't. I flinched. It wasn't like Gabe to raise his voice. From a table across the aisle, a couple of kids looked at us curiously. Gabe averted his eyes. I don't want to talk about it, he said. I did something I wasn't proud of, okay? But what's past is past. I wish you would think of me as the perfectly normal person that I am now. I had trouble sleeping that night. I tossed and turned in my blankets, drifting in and out of vague nightmares that I didn't know the beginnings or endings of. I kept thinking about what Gabe had said. My mind went in circles speculating on what terrible thing he could have done to make his reflection come after him. I chastised myself at every turn for entertaining such a ridiculous idea, that reflections could be sentient entities and that they could crawl out of a mirror to this side of the world. Yet my breath was still tinged with the scent of garlic because I had been too scared to stand in the bathroom to brush my teeth. It felt like my eyes in the mirror were watching my every movement. It must have been well past midnight when I heard the kitchen window slide open. There was soft breathing. The sound of careful footsteps on the tiles. The shuffle of cloth. And after a short pause, the horribly familiar sound of one of our large kitchen knives sliding out of the wooden knife block. Perhaps it was the wintry air coming in through the open window, perhaps it wasn't, but a sinister cold feeling settled at the back of my neck. I laid on my couch, paralyzed. Quiet footsteps made their way out of the kitchen and began to approach. When they came close, in a momentary feat of courage, I opened my eyes in slits from between my blankets. The diffuse glow of the streetlights illuminated a single, unmistakable face. Gabriel. Except it wasn't. Even in the dim lighting, I could see that everything about him was simply wrong. His ever-present cable-knit beanie was gone, and his dark hair hung in damp uncombed tufts. He wore a torn grey jacket with its collar flipped up. His glasses were the thin wire-rimmed ones he used to wear in freshman year. He held our German chef's knife in his right hand. The right-handed Gabe hadn't noticed that I was awake. As I laid frozen in my blankets, he slowly turned away and began walking toward the back of the apartment. Desperately praying that the intruder couldn't hear the blankets shifting on my body, I reached out to grab my phone from the coffee table. But before I could try to call the police, before I could even wrap my trembling fingers around my phone, the footsteps disappeared into the carpeted back room. The next thing I heard was Gabe's scream. Without thinking, I threw off my blankets, stumbled to my feet, and made a mad dash for Gabe's room. I slammed my palm on the light switch and was greeted by a scene out of my nightmares. There was so much blood. For a moment, it was all I could see. Blood spattered on the silvery wallpaper and on Gabe's proudest and most beautiful paintings that he mounted on black cardstock and hung on his wall. Blood all over the cozy twin bed. I gripped the doorway as a wave of nausea threatened to bring me down to my knees. My roommate, the Gabe I knew, the Gabe who combed his hair neatly and put his horn-rimmed glasses on his nightstand and went to bed in soft fleece pajamas, was pinned to the corner between the edge of his bed and the wall, his shirt slashed to pieces and the heavy blade of the kitchen knife stuck half an inch deep in his chest. Bent over him was the intruder, the stranger who wore the guise of my friend, steadily pressing down on the hilt of his knife. Gabe let out a strained moan that might have been my name. The intruder turned his face toward me. Madness pulsed in his bloodshot eyes. The mask that he wore was so familiar that seeing anything other than Gabe in his expression was sickening. "Don't move a fucking inch," he snarled in my roommate's voice. "If you know what's good for you." I stared back at him, pathetically unable even to make a sound. The intruder turned back to Gabe and laughed. "I finally caught you," he breathed. "You knew I was coming, didn't you? I'd have given anything to blow you and your pretty little world to dust. It's a pity. But they'll do just fine." Gabe's arms and legs spasmed, struggling to break free, but he was helplessly trapped. "Look at me, you fucking monster," the intruder hissed, words pushing through hysteria. "This was supposed to be my life. Do you hear me? All this was supposed to be mine." The sickening crunch of bone turned my insides. The kitchen knife sank up to its hilt in flesh and blood. Gabe howled, his voice echoing down the neighborhood. Then, without a sound save for a small cough, he fell limp. "Die, motherfucker," the right-handed stranger muttered through his teeth. "Go back to hell where you belong." He was met with no answer. Everything was silent. Slowly, the intruder turned to me again. His lips trembled before spreading into a thin smile. "Why, hello there," he whispered. "You must be my roommate." I took half a step back. The room tilted back and forth. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I've come to liberate you from this monster. Has he told you about me? Did he relish the way he tortured me? Did you know I even existed?" Behind him, swaddled in bloodied sheets, I thought I saw Gabe's hand twitch. My eyes widened. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Before I could say a word, Gabe, the real Gabe, heaved himself upright, pulled his pocket knife from underneath his pillow, snapped open its tiny iridescent blade, and sank it deep into the side of his doppelganger's neck. The plastered-on smile on his face stiffened. Blood spurted from his wound. Manic adrenaline pumped the stranger's life out onto the ratty carpet, and in less than a minute, he was a white corpse on the floor. Gabe slumped back onto his bed. His eyes rolled back in his head. I stumbled into the room on puppet limbs, my ears ringing and my stomach twisted in knots, and clamped my hands around his blood-slicked pajamas. "Gabe," I gasped, shoving his limp body up into my arms. "Gabriel, stay with me." His head lolled. In my completely rattled state of mind, I somehow found the clarity to refrain from pulling the kitchen knife out of his chest for fear he would lose more blood. I tore the sheets off his bed and twisted it as tightly as I could around his chest. "Oh, God," I muttered, slamming the apartment door open and carrying Gabe down the stairs. "Oh, God, why is this happening?" I tried not to feel how cold he had become. I tried not to gauge how much blood we were leaving smeared on the stairs behind us. I especially tried not to look at where the knife had pierced his flesh, square in the middle of the chest if not for its slight, very calculated tilt leftwards, broken clean through the ribcage. The drive to the emergency room was a blur. There were no cars on the road. As soon as we got to the hospital, people began shouting, white-clad medical staff barking orders. Someone wrestled Gabe's body out of my arms. I found myself sitting in the ER waiting room, staring down at the rusty stains on my bare feet. It was deep into the cold lonely night when the doors to the hallway slid open and a uniformed man walked out. "Are you with the young man who came in at 1:20? "He didn't come in," I said hoarsely. "Is he alive?" "The doctors are working on him right now," he said. "I wanted to ask you something." "Working on him, as in he can be saved?" The man pursed his lips. "Is Gabe alive or not?" I snapped. "He is." My shoulders relaxed, just a little bit. I breathed out and sat back in my chair. "It's actually about that," the man said. "About what?" "About your friend being alive. Are you aware of anything unusual about him?" I looked away. The man shuffled his feet. When I looked back at him, he looked nervous, like he expected me to say something terrible. "It's nothing unusual," I said. "Treat it like everything's normal." When I finally got to visit Gabe, he had regained enough motor control to sit up and draw again. For a long while, I just watched him sketch on his lap. "I'm sorry I couldn't do anything," I said. I was scared. Gabe paused. His pencil hovered over the paper as he pushed up his glasses with his other hand. "It's okay," he said. "I don't blame you." "Do you believe him? About how you're a monster?" Gabe averted his eyes. Silence hung between us long enough for him to resume sketching. Faces bloomed on the page, strangers out of the imagination. "The doctors told me something," I said. "They asked if I knew anything unusual about you. I thought they were talking about the reflection at first, but there's something else too, isn't there?" Gabe tensed. He didn't say anything. "They told me how you survived the stab wound. You have your heart in the right side of your chest." "Leo. It's you, isn't it?" I said. "You're the one who came out of the mirror." I could almost feel the air in the room grow colder. Gabe's eyes were dark, unreadable. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. "He was a terrible person." I nodded. When I went back to the apartment to wrap the garbage bag onto his corpse, I had seen the old bruise scars around his neck. The shadows under his eyes from being haunted by supernatural wrath. Everyone around him was miserable, Gabe muttered. Miserable, or dead. He was a maniac. I should have killed him when I first had the chance. "He's gone now," I said. Gabe nodded. Then he took in a shaky breath. "I killed him," he said. "I killed a person, Leo. What am I gonna do?" "We'll figure it out," I said, as reassuringly as I could manage with a dead body rotting back in my apartment. Gabe smiled weakly. "Figure it out," he repeated. "Yeah?" He let out a small chuckle and shook his head. The movement made him sway, and I rushed to help him lie back down on his soft white pillow. "I came out because I wanted to meet humans like you," he said quietly. "Humans who deserved to know the better half of me." Outside, in the distance, the wail of police sirens began to fill the morning fog.